I often wake up before the alarm rings, not because I have anywhere pressing to go or anyone waiting for me, but simply because age does that to you. The body loses its rhythms, the mind wakes early, and you are left lying in a bed that feels far too wide and far too cold. I lie there staring at the ceiling fan turning in slow circles and listen to the faint ticking of the wall clock in the hallway. And for a long moment I try to remember what it used to sound like when my wife's soft breathing was beside me. When there was another human presence in the room. My name is Arthur Langford. I am 76 years old, and I live alone in a modest single-story home on the edge of Omaha, Nebraska, a place that has been mine for almost 40 years, filled with the residue of another life that sometimes feels as though it belonged to someone else entirely. The curtains are the same ones my wife picked out in the late 90s. The china cabinet still holds plates we only used on Christmas and Easter. The garden tools rust slowly in the shed, and yet without her presence, without the weight of another soul moving through these rooms, the house has shrunk into something hollow, a shell that echoes with footsteps and memories instead of laughter and conversation. I am not a man of extraordinary means, but I was careful and steady. I worked for decades as a postal clerk, never rich but never reckless, and between my pension, social security, and the savings, my wife and I scraped together over years of disciplined budgeting. I have enough to live out the rest of my life without fear of hunger or eviction. I pay my bills on time, I keep my lawn trimmed, I drive carefully and only in the daylight hours, I take my prescribed blood pressure medication, and in short, I try to live quietly and without disturbing anyone. But it is impossible to live entirely without needing others, and the only close family I have left is my daughter Claire, who is 45, married to a man named Daniel, and mother to 2 teenage sons whom I see less and less each passing year. Claire lives across town, barely 20 minutes by car, yet sometimes the distance feels like an ocean, because weeks can pass without her calling, and when she does appear it is usually hurried, as though my presence is another appointment in her crowded calendar, something to be checked off quickly before moving on to something more important. When my wife, Helen, passed away 9 years ago after a merciless bout with cancer, I thought Claire and I would grow closer, that grief would bind us together the way shared tragedy sometimes does. I imagined Sunday dinners, or small rituals where we remembered Helen and held on to one another, but life did not unfold that way. At first, Claire was present. She visited weekly, she helped me clear out closets, she cooked simple meals when I was too lost in mourning to prepare food myself. But over time, her visits became less frequent, the phone calls shorter, the conversations dominated by her work deadlines or the needs of her boys. I told myself it was natural, that she was building her own life, and that I should not cling too tightly. But somewhere deep inside I could not shake the quiet sting of being set aside, like a book that had been read once and then returned to the shelf to collect dust. I fill my days with small routines. I make oatmeal with raisins for breakfast. I walk slowly around the neighborhood with a cane, though the doctor tells me exercise will keep my legs strong. I water the rose bushes Helen planted long ago, though I have never had her knack for gardening, and in the evenings I watch old westerns on television until sleep overtakes me in the armchair. Some mornings I drive to the library and sit among the shelves just to feel the hum of life around me, and other times I take the long route to the grocery store so I can exchange a few polite words with the cashier, the bagger, or even a stranger in the produce aisle. Loneliness is not always a scream. It is sometimes just the absence of being included in anyone's thoughts, the silence after the phone stops ringing, the realization that days and weeks can pass without anyone asking how you are. Still, despite the loneliness, I had always believed I remained in control of my own life. I balanced my checkbook carefully every month. I kept cash in my wallet for small purchases. I withdrew money from the bank myself when I needed it, and I was proud that even at my age, I did not rely on anyone else to manage my affairs. Perhaps that pride was naive. Perhaps it blinded me to what was happening slowly and insidiously in my own family. But until very recently, I thought of myself as competent, independent, capable of deciding how to live out my final years. My daughter, however, seems to have begun looking at me differently. At first it was small things, the way she sighed when I asked her to read a document with fine print, or the way she frowned when I took out a $20 bill instead of swiping a debit card. Then came the comments, slipped casually into conversations. "Dad, maybe it's time to think about simplifying things," or "You don't really need to handle all those bills yourself anymore, it's stressful." I would laugh them off, try to change the subject, but the remarks kept returning, each time sharper, less disguised. And then, one afternoon not long ago, she reached across the counter in my own kitchen, snatched my worn leather wallet out of my hands, and said in a tone that was half condescending and half triumphant, "You don't need cash, Dad. You don't need it anymore. We'll handle things for you." That moment crystallized something inside me. It was not simply the act of taking the wallet, it was the assumption behind it, the quiet rewriting of the roles between us. I was no longer the father, the provider, the man who had raised her and paid for her education. In her eyes, I had become a frail old man. Autonomy could be casually stripped away for the sake of convenience. I stood there, stunned, unable to form words, while she slipped the wallet into her purse and smiled as though she had solved a problem rather than committed an insult. That smile haunted me. Later that night when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan again, realizing that I was on the edge of losing something more precious than money, the right to be recognized as a person who still mattered, who still had agency over his own life. What unsettled me most was not only the action itself, but the thought that it was not spontaneous. Claire and Daniel had spoken to me before about modernizing my finances, suggesting joint accounts, automatic payments, credit cards linked to their household, all under the guise of helping me. I had resisted politely, saying I preferred things the old-fashioned way, but their persistence had grown over the past year. Now I could see that the wallet incident was not a momentary impulse. It was a step in a deliberate progression, and in that realization, the quiet rhythms of my daily life, once dull but dependable, suddenly seemed fragile, as though the ground beneath me could be taken away at any time. So this is where I find myself now, a man nearing the end of his life, caught between the desire to trust the only child I have left, and the gnawing suspicion that she sees me less as a father and more as an obstacle to wealth she believes already belongs to her. I write these words not to accuse, but to remember, to set down the truth as I lived it, because in the confusion of age it is easy for others to twist the story and make you doubt your own memory. I know what I saw, what I felt, and though part of me still aches with love for my daughter, another part, the part that has been bruised by years of neglect and small humiliations, whispers that I must be careful, that what I thought was family may no longer be family in the way that word once meant. And perhaps the saddest thing of all is that even as I set down these thoughts, even as I feel anger and betrayal simmering within me, I still find myself longing for the simplest thing, for Claire to sit beside me, not as an accountant, not as a guardian, not as a claimant to an inheritance, but simply as my daughter, the little girl with pigtails who once held my hand at the county fair and begged me for cotton candy. The incident that set everything into motion did not come with warning drums or lightning strikes. It came on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon when the weather was neither good nor bad, just a flat grey sky that seemed to press down on the rooftops of the neighborhood, and I was sitting at the kitchen table going through the electric bill with a pair of reading glasses perched low on my nose. I remember that the bill itself was unremarkable, the numbers the same as they had been for months, and I was carefully writing out a check in my slow, deliberate hand when I heard the sound of the front door opening without a knock. Only one person in my life still entered the house that way, my daughter. And sure enough, there she was, stepping briskly inside, her coat still dusted with the remnants of an early spring drizzle, her handbag swinging from her arm, her voice already raised as though she were in the middle of a conversation that had started before she even crossed the threshold. "Dad, you're still paying bills like this," she said, her eyes darting immediately to the checkbook, her mouth tightening with something halfway between a smirk and a sigh. I looked up, trying to greet her warmly. But before I could say anything, she was standing over me, one hand on her hip, the other reaching for the pen I was holding. "You don't need to do this anymore," she continued, writing checks, licking stamps, walking to the mailbox. "It's outdated. Daniel and I have been telling you for months we can handle all of this online. All you need to do is let us take over." I tried to make a joke of it, to keep the mood light, and said something about being one of the last men in Nebraska who still believed in envelopes and postage stamps. But she didn't laugh. Instead, she reached down and slid the checkbook toward herself, as though I were a child doodling on the wrong paper. And in that small gesture, I felt the peculiar chill that comes when someone close to you ceases to see you as an equal. I asked her to please give it back, that I had always managed the bills myself, but she ignored me and began flipping through the stubs, her eyes scanning the entries. I saw her lips move as she calculated, and then she asked with a sharpness that caught me off guard, "Why did you withdraw $600 in cash last week? What did you spend it on?" It was such a strange question that for a moment I didn't know how to answer. I told her I had taken out the money to pay the man who fixed the gutters, and that I liked keeping a little extra cash in the house just in case, but she shook her head as though I had confirmed some private suspicion. "Dad, you can't keep doing this," she said, "carrying around bills in your wallet, hiding money in drawers. It's not safe. You'll lose it or forget it, or worse, someone will take advantage of you." The irony of that last phrase did not strike me fully until later. I rose from my chair, partly out of indignation and partly to reach for the checkbook she still held, and in that moment the confrontation took its decisive turn. She pulled back swiftly, her movements sharp, and then with the same casual boldness that a parent might use to take a dangerous object from a toddler, she leaned forward, slid her hand into the breast pocket of my shirt, and pulled out my wallet. Before I could react, she was already holding it aloft, her eyebrows raised in triumph, her voice ringing through the kitchen with the sentence that has burned into my memory ever since. "You don't need cash anymore, Dad. You don't need it. We'll handle it from now on." The words struck me with a peculiar force, not because of their volume, but because of the certainty behind them, the way she had pronounced a verdict without trial, a sentence without defense. She flipped open the wallet in front of me, thumbed through the bills, and with a little cluck of disapproval, slipped them into her own handbag. Then, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, she placed the empty wallet on the counter, patted my shoulder, and began talking about how she and Daniel would set up a joint account, how all my utility bills could be automated, how there was no reason for me to bother with such things anymore. I stood frozen, feeling at once humiliated and disoriented, because the room around me was the same kitchen where I had once taught her how to measure flour for cookies, where Helen used to hum while stirring soup on the stove, and yet now it felt foreign, occupied by someone who saw me not as a father, but as an old man whose independence was a problem to be solved. I tried to protest, my voice shaking, saying that I had managed my affairs for decades, that I was not helpless, but she brushed it off with that gentle but infuriating tone people use with children, saying, Of course, Dad. Of course, you've done well, but times are changing and we just want to make sure everything is easy for you. She spoke as though this was a gift, a kindness, a form of protection. But what I heard beneath her words was something colder, a kind of claim being staked. I saw in her eyes not just concern, but calculation, the same expression I had seen years ago when she first asked for money for a down payment on her house. The look of someone who had decided in advance that the answer would be yes. I felt heat rising in my chest, not only from anger but from shame, because I realized I had allowed this pattern to grow, one concession after another, until she felt entitled to reach into my shirt pocket and take what was mine. After a few more sentences about online banking and keeping things safe, she glanced at her watch, said she had to hurry back across town to pick up her sons from practice, and without waiting for my reply, she kissed me quickly on the cheek and headed for the door. I stood there at the table, my check half written, my wallet empty, the bills still lying unpaid, and I felt a silence settle over the room that was heavier than any I had known since Helen's death. That night I could not sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan again, hearing her words over and over. You don't need cash anymore. The phrase seemed simple on the surface, but the more I thought about it, the more sinister it became, as though hidden within those words was a declaration that I no longer had the right to decide how to live my own life, that I was already being rehearsed for the role of a dependent, a man waiting quietly while others handled everything for him. It was not only the money she had taken, it was the precedent, the door that had been opened. I turned the events of the day over in my mind until the early hours of the morning, and by the time the first weak light filtered through the curtains, I had made a decision. If I did nothing, if I allowed this to pass unchallenged, then the next step would follow naturally. Joint accounts, signatures, powers of attorney, and soon enough I would find myself reduced to a guest in my own life. I would not let that happen. I might be old, I might be lonely, I might even be slower than I once was, but I was not yet ready to surrender the little dignity I had left. And so, as soon as the bank opened that morning, I put on my best coat, took the bus downtown, and closed the account that bore my name, transferring every last cent into a new one that no one but me would touch. The days that followed my decision to close the account and place every cent under my sole control should have brought me peace. But instead they opened a chapter of tension I had not anticipated, because money, once it becomes the subject of mistrust inside a family, never returns to being only money. It becomes the battlefield upon which respect, loyalty, and even love are measured. For a brief moment after I left the bank that morning with the new account papers in my pocket, I felt a surge of relief, the quiet satisfaction of having acted before it was too late, of proving to myself that I was not the helpless old man my daughter seemed to think I was. But that sense of victory lasted only until the following weekend, when Claire appeared unannounced at my door with Daniel in tow, both of them carrying expressions that were meant to look concerned, but which I read. Instantly, as rehearsed, coordinated, and underpinned by a single motive, Claire began with the pretense of casualness, setting a casserole dish on my counter and fussing over the kitchen as though she were still a teenager tidying up for approval. But her eyes darted constantly to my desk where the checkbook lay, to the drawer where she knew I once kept small envelopes of cash, and finally to me, measuring my reactions like a doctor waiting to diagnose a patient. Daniel, meanwhile, stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, too stiff to be relaxed, his mouth pressed into a line that suggested he was here against his will, or at least impatient to get through whatever confrontation was planned. After a few meaningless pleasantries, Claire finally sat across from me at the table, folded her hands in front of her, and said, "Dad, we need to talk about the way you're handling things, because Daniel and I are worried." The word worried might once have stirred gratitude in me, but in that moment it felt like a weapon, a lever being used to pry away my confidence. I asked her calmly what exactly she was worried about, and she launched into a litany of supposed incidents: that I had forgotten to pay the water bill on time last month, that I had been seen by a neighbor wandering in the supermarket looking confused about the aisles, that I had left the back porch light burning all night. Each accusation landed with a thud in my chest because none of them were true. I had paid the water bill early, as I always did. I had indeed gone to the supermarket, but with a list, and the only reason I paused was because they had moved the bread to another aisle, and the porch light was automatic, set on a timer I had programmed myself. But as she spoke, she leaned forward, lowering her voice, painting a picture of a man who was slipping, a man losing his grip, and Daniel nodded along at intervals as though to confirm the diagnosis. I tried to answer each point, to explain, but the more I defended myself, the more they looked at me with pitying expressions, as if my insistence only proved my decline. That was when Claire brought out the true purpose of the conversation. She pulled a folder from her handbag, laid it on the table, and slid it toward me with the same firmness she had once used as a child when presenting me with a school permission slip to sign. "Dad," she said, "this is a document that will make everything simpler. It gives us joint authority over your accounts so we can help with the bills, protect your savings, make sure nothing is forgotten. It's really just a safety net. You don't even have to think about it after this. We'll handle things for you." My hand trembled as I touched the folder, not from weakness, but from the sudden realization that this was the direction everything had been heading since the day she grabbed my wallet. It was not about convenience, it was not about modernity, it was about access, control, and the slow erosion of my autonomy. I opened the folder with deliberate slowness, scanned the first few lines, and though I am no lawyer, I saw enough to understand. It was a power of attorney, a legal instrument that would place the entirety of my financial life into their hands, allowing them to move money, sell assets, and sign in my name. I closed it and pushed it back across the table. My voice was steady when I said, "No, Claire, I will not sign this. I don't need anyone else to handle my affairs." The air in the room tightened instantly. Claire's face flushed, and she began to protest that I was being stubborn, that I was refusing help out of pride, but Daniel cut in with a sharper edge. "Arthur," he said, deliberately using my first name instead of Dad, "you need to understand that these things are not optional forever. The courts can decide, the doctors can decide, and if it comes to that, you'll wish you had made it easier for yourself and for us." The casual threat in his tone made my stomach turn. My son-in-law, a man for whom I had once co-signed a car loan, was speaking to me as though I were already half gone, as though the only question left was how quickly my rights could be stripped from me. I looked at him for a long moment and then back at Claire, searching her face for some flicker of the daughter I remembered, the girl who used to bring me drawings of tulips and ask if I thought they were good enough for the fridge. But what I saw instead was calculation, anxiety sharpened into insistence, the determination of someone who had convinced herself that taking control was not only permissible, but righteous. I told them both, as firmly as I could manage, that I had already arranged my finances, that everything was under control, and that the matter was not open for discussion. Claire's lips tightened. Daniel muttered something under his breath, and then, after a long silence, they gathered their things and left, the casserole dish still cooling on the counter like an afterthought. In the quiet that followed, I sat at the table with my heart pounding. I realized that the battle was no longer about whether I needed help, but about whether I had the right to refuse it. My daughter and her husband had crossed a line, and though I had resisted, I could see clearly that they would not stop. Every small action, Every visit, every conversation from now on would be aimed at proving a narrative of decline, constructing a version of me that was incompetent, vulnerable, and in need of guardianship. And once that narrative was accepted by others, by neighbors, by bankers, by doctors, the truth of my own competence would no longer matter. The following week, the campaign continued in subtler ways. I overheard a neighbor mentioning that Claire had told her I was having trouble keeping track of things. At the pharmacy, the clerk asked if I wanted to set up an automatic refill like your daughter suggested. Even at church, one of the elders put a hand on my shoulder and said, "We're praying for your memory, Arthur." I stood there smiling faintly, nodding politely, but inside I felt a storm of humiliation because I knew exactly where these whispers originated. Claire was preparing the ground, sowing doubts in the minds of everyone around me, so that when the day came to push for legal control, she could point to a chorus of voices all agreeing that, yes, poor Arthur was slipping. It is a terrible thing to be alive and aware while others begin writing your obituary in advance, not of your life, but of your capacity to live it. I found myself second-guessing even the smallest decisions. Did I leave the stove on? Did I misplace the keys? Did I forget a date? Because I knew that every mistake, however minor, would be catalogued and presented as evidence. In those days, I felt the walls of my own house closing in, not because of the rooms themselves, but because they echoed with the footsteps of people who no longer saw me as myself. Yet even in the midst of this, a part of me steeled itself. The humiliation sparked anger, and the anger sparked resolve. I told myself that if Claire and Daniel wanted a battle for my dignity, they would find I was not so easily erased. I began keeping meticulous notes of everything, when I paid bills, when I took medicine, when I locked doors, so that I would have proof against their claims. I carried a small notebook in my pocket and wrote down every interaction, every purchase, every errand, not out of paranoia, but out of defense. If they intended to depict me as a man slipping into confusion, then I would arm myself with the record of my own clarity. Still, the tension weighed on me. I would wake in the night with my heart racing, remembering Daniel's words about the courts and the doctors, the chilling reminder that power could be taken if others decided I was unfit. I lay there in the darkness, wondering how many more small humiliations would come, how many more whispers behind my back before the next decisive blow. And as much as I wanted to believe that love would eventually restrain my daughter, that she would remember I was her father before she allowed greed or fear to overtake her, the evidence before me was mounting in the opposite direction. What had begun with a wallet had already grown into a campaign, and I knew with a cold certainty that worse was coming. The confrontation I feared came sooner than I expected, not in the form of a dramatic outburst, but in a quiet moment at the bank that left me shaking with the realization that what I had suspected all along was not only true, but already well in motion, and that I was not simply imagining the threat, I was standing directly in its path. It was a Tuesday morning, clear and mild, and I had gone downtown to deposit a small check from the insurance company that had overbilled me the previous year. These errands always gave me a sense of control, a small ritual where I confirmed to myself that I was still the steward of my own affairs. I greeted the teller, a young man who always smiled politely but rarely looked me in the eye, and after handing him the check, I asked almost casually if there had been any unusual requests or notes placed on my account. I expected the usual answer, "No, sir, everything is normal." But instead he frowned slightly, typed something into his computer, and said he would call the manager. When the branch manager, a woman named Evelyn, whom I had known for years, came out of her office, her expression carried a mixture of sympathy and hesitation, and before she even spoke, I felt the weight settle in my stomach. She asked me to step into her office for privacy, and there, behind the closed door, she explained in careful words that my daughter had been in recently with papers requesting authorization to act on my behalf. She said Claire had insisted it was for my protection, that I was becoming forgetful, and had asked her to help. Evelyn said the bank had not processed the request because it lacked my signature, but the fact that the attempt had been made at all was like a blade sliding between my ribs. I sat very still while Evelyn spoke, nodding slowly, pretending to take it in stride, but inside my mind was racing. Claire had not simply pressured me at home. She had carried her campaign into the world, attempting to alter the very structure of my independence without telling me. I asked Evelyn for the documents, and she showed me the photocopies. A proposed joint account, a power of attorney form, even a letter written in my daughter's hand claiming that I had verbally agreed but had been too overwhelmed to complete the paperwork. I stared at the neat script, so familiar from birthday cards and notes tucked into lunchboxes decades ago, and now repurposed into an instrument of betrayal. I thanked Evelyn for her caution, promised I would keep my accounts under my sole control, and left the bank with my knees trembling. As I stepped out into the sunlight of Main Street, the town around me looked unchanged. Cars passed, people hurried to lunch, pigeons fluttered near the fountain. But for me, the landscape had tilted irrevocably. It was no longer a matter of suspicion or fear, it was fact. My daughter was preparing to strip me of my authority, using the language of protection to disguise the reality of seizure. The walk back to the bus stop felt endless. I replayed the past months in my mind. The wallet snatched from my pocket, the folder of papers pushed across my table, the whispered comments to neighbors about my supposed forgetfulness. Each piece that had seemed like a separate irritation now fell into place as part of a strategy, and the picture it formed was chillingly clear. If she succeeded, I would become little more than a name on an account, a signature they could forge, a figurehead while others made every decision for me. I would live, but I would no longer belong to myself. That night, the house seemed colder than ever. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the accounts ledger I kept, the neat rows of numbers stretching back for years, each page a testament to the life Helen and I had built with patience and thrift. I imagined her sitting across from me, her gentle hand on mine, her voice reminding me to stay strong, to protect what we had worked for. And in that moment, grief mixed with anger, because it was not only my autonomy at stake but the legacy of both of us, the fruits of decades of labor now threatened by the very child we had once trusted above all. Sleep eluded me. I wandered from room to room, touching the photographs on the walls, the furniture we had chosen together, the keepsakes of a marriage that had endured storms and sacrifices. Everything in that house bore the mark of effort, of memory, of meaning, and yet I could see how easily it might all be taken, sold, or reduced to numbers in a ledger if I yielded. For the first time since Helen's death, I spoke aloud in the empty house, my voice trembling. No one will take this from me. Not like this. The next morning, with a clarity that surprised me, I made appointments with a lawyer recommended by an old neighbor, determined to review my will, my property deeds, and every account with fresh eyes. I no longer had the luxury of trust. I needed defenses, paper walls stronger than sentiment. As I gathered the documents, sliding them into a worn leather briefcase, I felt both weary and resolved, because the battle I had hoped to avoid was upon me, and whether I wanted it or not, I had been forced to choose sides. What made this moment the true midpoint of everything was not only the discovery at the bank, but the shift it caused in me. Until then I had been reactive, hurt, and humiliated, but still hoping for reconciliation, still believing that perhaps Claire was misguided rather than malicious. But standing in Evelyn's office, reading those forged intentions in my daughter's hand, I understood that the matter had gone too far to be undone with conversation or forgiveness. This was now a struggle for survival in the only sense that remained to me. The survival of my independence, my name, my dignity. From that day forward, every step I took, every decision I made, carried the weight of that realization, and there would be no turning back. I left the lawyer's office with a folder of freshly signed papers pressed against my ribs like a shield, and though the documents themselves were simple, revoking any old powers of attorney I had once granted in casual moments, appointing a professional fiduciary as my backup should I truly become incapacitated, updating my will to reflect the reality that love without respect is not love I will reward. They felt heavy in my hands, as if the weight of years of silence and small humiliations had finally been packed into Manila and stapled along the edges. Mr. Keating, a quiet man with tired eyes who had seen this story in 100 living rooms, urged me to go slowly, to keep records, to let paper do the talking, and I promised I would. Yet when I stepped into the parking lot, I found Claire leaning against Daniel's SUV as if the meeting were a family errand and not a boundary I had drawn, and before I could even greet her, she pushed off the fender and came toward me with that brisk, efficient gait of hers, saying she'd scheduled a memory checkup. For next week? Nothing to worry about, just a routine screening at a clinic Daniel's colleague recommended, and that it would be so much easier if I didn't make everything a debate because she and Daniel were only trying to prevent a crisis. I told her calmly that I'd discussed my medical care with my own physician and that I would not be attending any appointment arranged without me. Daniel's door popped open like a punctuation mark, and he called across the asphalt that I was being unreasonable, that the courts took these matters seriously if a family member raised concerns, and the implication hung between us like exhaust, souring the air. If I did not cooperate, they would escalate. I walked past them, not quickly. Nothing about me is quick anymore, but with a steadiness that surprised me. And when I reached the bus stop, I sat down and folded my hands atop the folder and felt, for the first time in months, the thin line of anger, hardening into resolve, because whatever came next would not be an argument over casseroles and checkbooks, it would be a campaign, and I would not face it muttering apologies. The first blow landed 2 mornings later in the form of a knock that was not a knock at all, but the flat, authoritative rap of knuckles trained to be heard. 2 uniformed officers stood on my porch with a woman in a cardigan who introduced herself as a caseworker from Adult Protective Services. And although their voices were polite and their shoes left no mud on the mat, the sight of them in my doorway sent a cold thread up my spine, because this was not the neighborly world of casseroles. Any more, this was the state, and the caseworker's questions, had I fallen recently? Did I ever forget to eat? Was there anyone helping me manage my medications? Were asked with the gentle smile of someone who has already been told the answers by a concerned relative. I offered them tea, because that is what Helen would have done, and we sat at the kitchen table where I produced my medication log, my grocery receipts, my blood pressure readings, and a tidy stack of bill stubs with dates circled and notations in my cramped hand. They looked at these papers with faint surprise, as if astonished that punctuality could be armor, and when the caseworker asked if there was a daughter who checked on me, I said yes, there is a daughter, and yes, she checks, and no, I will not sign any releases permitting anyone to act on my behalf without my explicit current consent. They left after 40 minutes with careful assurances that this was just a wellness check. And I stood in the doorway for a long time after the patrol car rolled away, feeling both vindicated and violated. Vindicated because the house had passed. Inspection like a ship before sailing. Violated because the inspection had been ordered by my own blood. That afternoon at the pharmacy, the clerk, who usually calls me Mr. Langford and asks about my roses, leaned over the counter and suggested I put my refills on autopay, so your daughter doesn't have to fix things after you forget. and at church the following Sunday the pastor's prayer for those struggling with confusion and their courageous caregivers made the pew feel like a spotlight aimed at the softest part of my chest. If the wellness check was the opening move, the next was theatre. At the supermarket a week later, I stood in line with bread and milk and a package of chicken thighs, while rehearsing in my mind the pea soup recipes Helen favoured when the weather turned, and when I reached for my wallet I discovered, to my legitimate alarm, that I had left it on the kitchen table, which is the kind of ordinary mistake any person can make, but the kind of error that would now be entered into a ledger against me. Before I could speak to the cashier, Claire appeared at my elbow as if conjured by a cue, her voice pitched just loud enough for the manager at the next register to hear, saying, "Dad, you forgot again, sweetie, no worries, I've got you." And she produced a card and paid while patting my forearm the way you might soothe a skittish cat, then turned her head and told the manager in a bright, public tone that it had been a tough month for our family, and that she and Daniel were managing his finances now, at which point the manager, a man who has rung up my groceries for 10 years, looked at me and then looked away the way people do when they've been drafted into someone else's narrative. I went home with the receipt burning in my pocket and wrote in my notebook exactly what had happened and why it mattered. And later that evening the phone rang, and the same manager, suddenly sheepish, explained that my daughter had asked for a copy of the surveillance footage for the doctor, and that while he couldn't hand out footage without a legal request, he wanted me to know she was trying. I thanked him for the call, hung up, and sat in the dim kitchen with the folder from Mr. Keating open to the page that said, in plain type, that pretexts are as dangerous as signatures, because they build a case even when the facts refuse to comply. The next morning I found Daniel in my side yard jiggling the padlock on the gate, claiming he was there to check the water heater, because Claire worried I might flood the house, and when I told him to leave he waved a paper in my face, an old repair, invoice with his name on it, hardly a warrant, and I called the non-emergency line and asked for an officer, and though the responding patrolman was courteous, he seemed weary of family fights, advising Daniel that he needed my permission to enter the property and advising me to work it out civilly, as if civility were still the currency being offered. I turned then to self-defense the way a cautious man sandbags before the river rises. I requested an immediate neuropsychological evaluation through my own doctor and sat for 3 hours in a quiet office, answering questions and drawing shapes and repeating word lists until my tongue went dry, and when Dr. Layton finished, she looked me in the eye and said that whatever decline the calendar might one day bring, on this day my cognition was solid, and she put it in writing on letterhead that Mr. Keating later notarized and sent to my bank. I placed fraud alerts with all 3 credit bureaus, and within a week a letter arrived, notifying me of an attempted new line of credit in a name too close to mine to be coincidence, which the bureau blocked because of the alert, and when I pulled my full report I saw inquiries I did not recognize, and addresses associated with me that were not mine, including, shamefully and predictably, Claire and Daniel's residence. I moved my safe deposit box to a different branch across town and told no one. I named Evelyn, the bank manager who had treated me like a person instead of a rumor, as my trusted contact on file rather than any family member. I forwarded my mail to a post office box because I no longer trusted the sanctity of my mailbox at the curb. In those busy, nerve-wracking days of paperwork and printers and phone calls, I also recalibrated the geography of my life. I stopped attending the Bible study where Claire sometimes floated her worried daughter lines. I chose a different grocery store where the manager didn't know my last name, and I told the neighbors, politely, firmly, that if anyone came to them with tales of my confusion, they were to send those tales back to the teller unopened. It felt like building a small, invisible fortress, not against the world, but against the story being told about me, because I had learned at last that the most dangerous theft is the theft of a narrative, the taking of your life and its simple facts, and their replacement with a version easier for others to use. And yet escalation breeds escalation, and so it was that a certified letter arrived on a Thursday bearing the stamp of the county court, informing me that my daughter had petitioned for temporary conservatorship on an emergency basis, claiming that I was at risk of financial harm and that immediate control of my assets by a responsible family member was necessary. The hearing would be in 72 hours. The petition attached affidavits from 2 neighbors I barely knew, one of them the man who walks his dog at dawn and waves from across the street, stating that I seemed confused in recent weeks, affidavits that Mr. Keating later told me were likely solicited by a mixture of concern and pressure. I felt an old, familiar tightness in my chest that night, and lay awake listening to the house creak as the temperature fell. And somewhere after midnight I rose and went to Helen's chair by the window and watched the slow patrol of the moon across the slats of the blinds and spoke aloud to the empty room the way a man talks to a long-absent friend, telling her that they were trying to turn me into a ghost while I was still breathing. The following day I gathered my logbooks, my receipts, doctor, Leighton's evaluation, a letter from my primary physician listing the medications I take and the independence with which I take them, and a note from Evelyn confirming that there had been no suspicious withdrawals and that my accounts were current. I wore my best jacket to the hearing, the one Helen said made me look like the kind of man who could be trusted with a secret, and I sat at the table with Mr. Keating, while Claire and Daniel sat at theirs, and when the judge asked questions, I answered in a voice that shook only at the edges, not from confusion, but from the loneliness of having to speak about one's own competence as if it were a crime. The judge denied the emergency petition pending further evaluation, ordered that no changes be made to my accounts without my written consent, and reminded Claire that help cannot be compelled by force of rumor. Her face crumpled then, not with remorse, but with offended certainty. And as we left the courtroom, Daniel muttered that I had humiliated their family, as if the family were a badge I had tarnished rather than a duty they had abandoned. One might hope the denial would cool the fever, but in truth it only changed its temperature. A week later my insurance company called to verify a request I had made to change beneficiaries, a request submitted online from an IP address not my own, and when I told the representative that I had made no such request and that my voice, were they to check, would match no recorded authorization, there was a pause, followed by the kind of professional sympathy that tells you the fraud department is about to become a new acquaintance. I recorded the incident number in my notebook, added it to the growing binder Mr. Keating now referred to as the record. And then, because I am not a man who believes in revenge, but I do believe in consequence, I drove to the modest office of a scholarship foundation that funds vocational training for kids who cannot afford college, and sat with a woman who reminds me of Helen's plain-spoken kindness, and I began the paperwork to designate them as the primary beneficiary of my life insurance and a portion of my estate, not to wound my daughter, but to acknowledge what love looks like when it no longer expects anything in return. That same afternoon I wrote letters to my grandsons, 2 envelopes, 2 different tones, one explaining in simple, unaccusing language that if they ever wondered why their inheritance was smaller than rumors had promised, the answer was that their parents had taught me, by deed and not word, how little they believed I existed beyond my accounts, and the other inviting them, if they wished, to know me as a person rather than a purse, to come sit by the lake with me one day and talk about anything besides money. I do not know if those letters will ever be opened. I addressed them and placed them in the desk beneath a note to be mailed upon my death, because at my age prudence is not paranoia, it is housekeeping. And still the second escalation had one more turn to make, a petty cruelty engineered to look like compassion. Claire arrived on a Sunday afternoon with grocery bags filled with low-sodium soups and nutrition shakes and a stack of pamphlets about aging in place, and she moved through my kitchen as if staging a home for buyers, turning labels outward, lining up pill bottles for a photograph. And when I asked her to stop, she said that images help when professionals need to see what we're doing for you, her voice hitching on the word we, as if it cast her as heroine rather than historian of my decline. She told me, almost casually, that Daniel's firm had lost a big contract and that things were tight, and then with a shrug like a stage cue, she added that it would be so much simpler if we combined households, sold my burdensome place, and moved me into their spare room where we can keep an eye on you. And I saw, with a clarity that was almost brutal, the entire geometry of the thing. The debt they would not name, the space they would fill with my furniture, the account they would treat as a reservoir to be tapped whenever the month ran long. I told her no, that I would not be moving anywhere I was not wanted for myself, and she smiled a tired, wounded smile and said that I was choosing strangers over family. Perhaps I am, I thought as she closed the door behind her. Perhaps the truth at the end of a long life is that strangers are simply people who have not yet decided what to take from you, and family are those who believe the taking is already there. Right, that night, before I slept, I arranged the folder and the binder and the notarized letter on the bedside table, not because I planned to read them again, but because I wanted to be able to reach for evidence as easily as others reached for accusations, and as the house settled into its familiar creaks, I understood that the next step would be theirs, that they would come with kinder words or harsher ones or with more official paper, and that when they did I would be ready, not vindictive, not screaming, simply ready, a man who still belonged to himself. The breaking point came not with shouting, not with a violent quarrel, but with the unbearable silence that fell over my home after the lawyer delivered the final notice to my daughter and her husband. For weeks I had endured their tactics, their staged humiliations, their attempts to plant doubt in the minds of neighbors and officials. But when the court hearing loomed and they realized I had taken legal steps to shield myself, the mask of concern slipped completely, and what remained was the naked fury of people who saw their inheritance slipping through their fingers. It was a Sunday morning when Claire arrived unannounced, pounding at my door with the frantic energy of someone who believes urgency can substitute for love. She stormed into the kitchen, her eyes bloodshot, her voice trembling not with sadness but with rage, demanding to know how I could betray my family by selling the house, by closing the joint account, by cutting her out as though she were a stranger. I listened in silence, because for once I understood that her words were not questions but accusations, rehearsed lines in a performance meant to rattle me into shame. When I finally spoke, I told her that betrayal had begun years ago, when she stopped inviting me to see my grandchildren, when she began measuring my worth not by my presence, but by the size of the checks I wrote, when she grabbed my wallet and told me I didn't need cash because she and Daniel would handle everything. She froze then, and for a fleeting second I thought I saw the little girl she had once been, confused, embarrassed, caught in a lie. But the expression hardened quickly into the steely mask she wore now, and Daniel stepped forward, his voice sharp and menacing. He said I was making a fool of myself, that if I didn't hand over control willingly, they would return to court with doctors and witnesses. They would build the case again, brick by brick, until no judge could ignore the picture of a frail old man, incapable of managing his affairs. The threat was clear, and yet instead of fear, I felt a strange calm, as if the storm had finally broken and the air was clear enough for me to see the truth. I told them that whatever narrative they spun, I had my records, my evaluations, my testimony, and that no lie, however persistent, could erase the facts. That afternoon, after they left in a storm of slamming doors and shouted insults that spilled into the street, I sat alone at my table, staring at the stack of documents and the new bank statements that bore only my name. I realized that the true climax was not in the courtroom or in the shouting matches, but in the quiet moment of decision, when I understood that I no longer needed their approval, their visits, or even their recognition as family. I had chosen to stand alone, to bear the loneliness that came with autonomy, rather than surrender my dignity for the false comfort of their conditional affection. In that moment, the weight of years of guilt and self-blame began to lift, and I saw with painful clarity that love cannot be demanded, respect cannot be forced, and that sometimes the only way to survive betrayal is to sever the ties that strangle you. When the court's ruling finally arrived, confirming my competence and granting me full authority over my property, I did not rejoice with triumph, but with something quieter, something heavier, relief, tinged with mourning. For though I had won the battle for my independence, I had lost my daughter, perhaps forever. Yet even in that loss, there was a strange kind of peace, because the war they waged against me had forced me to reclaim myself, to remember that I was still capable of choice, of resistance, of drawing a line that no one, not even my own flesh and blood, could cross. In the weeks that followed the judgment, my life settled into a strange quiet. Not the ordinary silence of a house without a companion, but a deeper and more decisive stillness, as though a door had closed somewhere behind me, and I was now walking down a hallway that no one else could enter. Claire did not call, she did not visit, and the grandchildren who had once come at least on holidays remained distant, bound no doubt by the bitterness their parents poured into their ears. At first I found myself staring at the telephone in the evenings, waiting for it to ring, rehearsing in my mind what I would say if she asked for forgiveness, how I would try to explain that it was not money I had withheld, but my right to live on my own terms. But as the days passed without a word, the waiting itself began to fade, and I realized that what I had truly longed for all along was not reconciliation, but clarity. I had it now, sharp and irrevocable, and though it cut deep, it also freed me. I began to rebuild my routines in ways that felt small but significant. I walked each morning to the park with my cane, and when a neighbor greeted me, I no longer braced for the pitying glance that suggested they had been told stories of my decline, because I knew the rumors had withered once the court ruled. I carried my own wallet proudly in my jacket pocket, the bills folded neatly, not because I needed to buy anything extravagant, but because each purchase, each exchange with a cashier, was an affirmation that I remained part of the world on my own terms. I visited the library and spoke with the young woman at the desk who always recommended novels she thought I might enjoy, and for the first time in years I accepted her invitation to join a reading group, not because I craved company, but because I no longer felt ashamed of being seen as I was. Independence, I discovered, is not about defiance alone, but about the quiet dignity of choosing how to spend your days. Still, there were moments when grief pierced me unexpectedly. Sometimes I would pass a playground and see a girl with her father's hand in hers, tugging him toward the swings, and I would remember the summers when Claire was small, her laughter rising above the cicadas, her trust in me absolute. And in those moments my chest would ache with a longing that no judgment, no lawyer, no bank account could erase. But then I would remind myself that the daughter I remembered had grown into someone who chose power over love, and that to keep clinging to the memory was to keep a ghost in chains. I let her go, not with anger, but with the sorrowful acceptance that some relationships die long before the people in them. One evening I took out the new will, the one that left the bulk of my estate to the Vocational Scholarship Fund, and I read it through slowly, not to double-check the legal terms, but to sit with the meaning of what I had done. I imagined the faces of young men and women, children of families like mine once was, who would be able to learn a trade or attend classes because of the money I had protected from those who would have squandered it. In that vision, I felt Helen's presence more strongly than I had in years, as if she were sitting beside me, her hand warm on mine, approving not because the money was secure, but because it was being turned into something that carried forward the values we had lived by: work, dignity, and the refusal to bow to selfishness. The house itself began to feel lighter. I cleaned the kitchen thoroughly, polishing the table where so many arguments had unfolded, until the wood shone again. I rearranged the photographs on the wall, keeping some of Claire when she was young, because the child she once was had been real and deserving of memory. But I moved them to a quieter corner, no longer the centerpiece of my daily view. Instead, I placed Helen's portrait in the living room where the afternoon light caught it, and when visitors from church or the neighborhood came by, I spoke of her with pride and let the conversation rest on the love that had shaped my life rather than the betrayal that had nearly undone it. Perhaps the most surprising change was the return of sleep. For months I had lain awake, rehearsing arguments, fearing accusations, imagining judges and social workers in my living room. But now, when I lay down at night, my body surrendered more easily to rest. I no longer dreamed of losing things. Instead, I dreamed of open roads, of rivers flowing, of gardens untended but still blooming. It was as if the mind, once released from siege, could wander again into landscapes of possibility. I do not fool myself into thinking the story is finished. I know Claire may one day return, whether out of guilt or necessity or simple calculation, and I cannot say with certainty how I will respond if that moment comes. Perhaps I will listen, perhaps I will remain silent, perhaps I will close the door. What I do know is that I will not again hand over my wallet, my accounts, my name, or my dignity. Not to her, not to anyone. Those belong to me until the final breath leaves my body, and only then will they pass on, not as spoils of a struggle, but as a gift I choose to give. For now, I live in the quiet rhythm of my own making, and though the house is still empty of voices at night, the silence no longer feels like an accusation. It feels like something earned, a space cleared of false promises, a place where the truth of my life, its struggles, its mistakes, its endurance, can stand unchallenged. And if the world remembers me not as a confused old man, but as someone who refused to surrender, then perhaps that will be enough.